All right. So we've all probably heard about natural selection. This is one of those things that teach you from early on. I want to emphasize, though, a few things that most people usually don't know about natural selection. First thing I want to emphasize is that in order to have any selective process, something that is happening in evolution, you need to have variation in the genetic pool, in the offspring. Another word for variation might be diversity. You need to have difference in order for evolution to work on anything. If we're all going to be the same from generation to generation, then there's nothing really for evolution to do. And so you need to have variation. And those people who have tried to get rid of variation and get rid of diversity are actually being fairly anti-evolutionary. Doesn't make sense. Evolution depends on being diverse and being varied. Now, you had a question about this, though. Just what? How does this happen? How does variation happen? It's a good question. Great question. We can see it. We can see that we are not exact copies of our parents. Thank God, right? You're like, oh, good. I'm not an exact copy of my parent. And we can see that even if you have a person who you are very closely related to, let's say a sibling, you're not the same as that person. And again, you're like, good. Yay. Not all the same. So part of this simply has to do with these complexities of your parents get together, people get together, and things get funny. There might be some crossing over in the genetic code. You never know. Mistakes are made. Things happen. There's variation, and that variation is very important. Now, that's just part of sexual reproduction. But there's also these things that happen. These genes aren't perfect. Every so often, there's a mutation. So often something happens and one of those C, G, A, or T's gets misplaced or omitted or double copied. Somebody hybridizes with somebody else and funny things happen. There's 3 different types of mutations that we talk about. Most mutations are neutral. They don't do anything. Our cells and our genes are mutating all the time. Most of them don't have any effect. They're just sitting there chilling, reproducing and splitting off, and it's not a big deal. A lot of mutations are not the best. They do something, I usually don't want this to happen. There's some sort of mutation that might cause a sickness or cause some sort of problem. A lot of mutations are not very good. But every so often, there's a mutation that might be advantageous. How do we know if a mutation is going to be advantageous or not? Absolutely. Whether we're going to classify a mutation as advantageous or not depends upon the environment. Is this going to be advantageous in this environment? And this is one of the things about natural selection, which very few people bother to tell you, is that what you're selecting for is whether a trait, whether it's mutated or just a trait that happens to be, what natural selection works on is whether it is advantageous or not within a particular environment. By the way, what do we know about environments from like now and like 10,000 years ago and like 100,000 years ago? What do we know about the environment or maybe 100 years from now? Do we know anything about the environment in these times? Let me put it to you this way. Is it all going to stay the same? No. The environment is constantly changing, just like we're constantly changing. And so what might be an advantageous trait right now, you fast forward 1,000 years and you're like, I don't like that trait so much anymore. My environment has changed. And so we have to be very careful. A lot of people talk about natural selection. They borrow this phrase, which is actually from Herbert Spencer, not Charles Darwin, which is called survival of the fittest. But fitness is only measured within a given environment. And when scientists, when evolutionary people talk about fitness, they have a very specific definition for it, which most of us can't wrap our heads around because we think about fitness as being the best and being healthy and sporty and all that. But really, when evolutionary people talk about fitness, it just means that you are more successful in passing on genes to your offspring. So a very fit, buff individual who has no children has an evolutionary fitness of 0. Whereas somebody who's just sitting around being lazy and happens to reproduce a lot for whatever reason has a lot of evolutionary fitness. So this is a word that is used in science much differently than we use it in everyday life. And it simply means that lots of stuff, lots of genes are being passed to the next generation, right? What happens with blue eyes? Where did those come from? Somebody had a blue-eyed mutation back there, and somehow that got spread around. Now, do blue eyes give us an evolutionary advantage? They do not. Right? There's not something, they might give us some advantage in certain situations if people like blue eyes, but for the most part, they are not evolutionarily advantageous for our survival. However, certain people have been over the years successful in having a fitness factor for blue eyes on an evolutionary level, that is passing their genes on to offspring. So again, natural selection is not actually survival of the fittest. It's always within an environment, and those environments change over time. The other thing that happens in human evolution and all over the place is lots of random stuff. Things that are not really selection at all. So we have what is called genetic drift. You know, there might be an accumulation of mutations or an accumulation of, I don't know, traits in a specific population, and that population drifts off, or there's something that happens to them. They talk about this in terms of what they call founder effect. So for whatever reason, a certain group from a larger population goes off and populates one island, and maybe those people all had dimples, or well, maybe they all didn't have dimples, and so there's going to be fewer dimples on this island than in other places. This is again random. There's not a reason why this happens. It just happens because of random stuff. Another thing that's random, genetic bottlenecking, which sounds funny, but what does that refer to? Okay, so creatures can get trapped in certain areas, or maybe they give the kind of terrible example of people with dimples all getting caught in some catastrophe, and then our dimple population is reduced. Sorry, dimple people. But this is a random thing that can happen. And then there's also gene flow. Yeah, there's gene flow, which different populations get together with each other and they keep exchanging genes. Even if this happens only every so often, it can result in the kinds of genetic similarities that we see among human beings. Are we doing any gene flow these days, human beings? How much would you say? A lot. Yes, they call it an abundance of gene flow in humans. The current abundance of gene flow in humans means humans are now less likely to evolve into different species than at any time in our hominin history. So say if you go back 1,000,000 years, actually, let's just go back about 500,000 years, where we have Homo erectus populations and Neanderthals and Denisovans. We now know that Denisovans and some of those others, Neanderthals, were actually the same species. They did get together. Talk about that later. But there was a little bit more divergence in the hominin population back then. Like I said, for the last 200,000 years, we, hominin humans, have been a continuous interbreeding species. And as we know, with people having a current abundance of gene flow, there's very little likelihood. In fact, I would say there's no likelihood that we are going to ever evolve into different species. There's less likelihood than any time in history. So, why are humans so similar genetically? Our textbook gives us several answers to this. First of all, for evolutionary terms, we Homo sapiens are a very young species. When I say 200 or 300,000 years, that is like a little short time, evolutionarily speaking. So evolutionarily speaking, people usually talk about millions of years. To say a species has been around for 200 or 300,000 years is not very long at all. The other thing is that humans have lots of gene flow. We can see that today. There's currently an abundance of gene flow, but this has been true since the time we were human. This has been true since the time we emerged as human beings or Homo sapiens within the African continent. There was lots of gene flow between various regions, and there continued to be gene flow as people spread in different parts of the world. There has always been gene flow. Like I said, we have a penchant for, we like to move around, we migrate, we trade, we interact with other people. We do fight with each other too. We do sometimes isolate ourselves from other people, but then we get back together and find ourselves moving and migrating, trading, and swapping genes around. The other crucial thing to think about with human beings is that most variation is what the geneticists call clinal. Let us say it occurs gradually across a range. Blood type is really interesting. In some ways, I believe the textbook tells us that the type O is what we mostly have, but there's also the A's and the B's and the ABs, and you got your pluses and minuses in there. But we can type it, right? We can get a definitive answer for it. So let us say something like skin color, we'll talk about is a perfectly clinal thing, and that if you lined everybody up in the world, there'd be no line in which you could draw, okay, here's the people who are of one skin color, and here's the people of another. Skin color is a perfectly gradual or clinal variation. Blood type is a little different. You're going to be A, B, or O. But the thing is that as a percentage of the population, blood type also exhibits what we call clinal or gradual geographic variation. So this is blood type O, right? And in this part of the world, in indigenous populations to South America, times have changed, but the indigenous people here probably had less variation in terms of their O blood type because that was one of the last places that people reached. However, there's other types within the Americas, and even in some parts of, say, the rim of Australia or southern Japan or parts of these, there's the same high rates of O blood type. But if you look at this map in terms of percentages, it's a gradual shift. So if you're walking along these areas, let's say you're walking along in Africa, you're going to see a gradual shift in the numbers of people that have a certain blood type as you go along this variant. So you're not going to be able to say, aha, here are all the people, and we can match up their skin color and their blood type, and we got it. They're a group. We're going to group them all together. We see these things spread all over the world. And by the way, this is with indigenous populations. This is before we had transoceanic travel. So most of the features that we see and can measure in human beings vary gradually over a geographic range or have clinal variation. The other thing about human beings and genetic variation, there is, of course, genetic variation in human beings, but what do we know about most of that variation? Where is it? Where's 85% of the genetic variation? "85% of genetic variation is within any local population." So let's say we have the whole of genetic variation, right? If you go to anywhere in the world, all the populations have within them about 85% of the genetic variation. There's a more complicated way to put this, is that there is always going to be more difference within any human group than there is between human groups. So we might group up all the people and say, we're going to take the people in this town and compare them with this people in this other town. And you're going to see more variation, let's say in height, tall and short, within that place than you are between that place. And this applies to genetic variation. That's one of the reasons why drawing these lines around groups and saying, aha, this is a hugely different group than this other group doesn't work with human beings. The other funny thing is, where do we find most of this genetic variation? If we had to find 90 more and more percentage of it, where would we find it? Most of human genetic variation is existed in Africa. In fact, some people say that if there was something that happened and only Africa was left, almost all human genetic variation is still within the continent of Africa. So because human evolution is centered in the homeland of Africa, that's where you're going to see this largest range of genetic variation. those of us that come from heritage in different continents in some ways are simply a subset, a smaller range of that greater variation that we see within the African continent. Now, human beings do sometimes get isolated geographically. So sometimes there are places that get cut off. Usually if you're cut off, though, seriously cut off, those populations end up dying. But there are times that people get geographically isolated. There are some times when people socially isolate themselves. So on page 66, it does say here that humans have added complexity because sometimes populations will become more or less genetically isolated through social and cultural practices, such as marriage rules or language differences. So we do sometimes isolate ourselves from other people, use language and other things, marriage rules, and we socially isolate ourselves. But I want to be very clear about this, that although certain populations sometimes get temporarily isolated from each other, and they say they hate each other, and they say they don't want to marry people from that place, somebody's going to be sneaking around and doing this. And so gene flow has always, throughout human history, has always been keeping us remarkably similar genetically. And it still is now keeping us remarkably similar genetically. As I said, we find ourselves, we often like to test the biological species concept, and it always works with human beings. So we aren't splitting off into different groups, and we won't be, even if we look different from each other.